Okay, well, thanks for being here, everybody. I'm so glad that you could join us for our webinar. We're going to be talking about some early detection invasive species today. Before we get started, I wanted to give all the presenters a chance to introduce themselves. So I'll be doing that here in just a moment. I did want to mention really quick questions. We do encourage everyone to ask questions if you have them. We do have a Q&A feature enabled, so please type your questions into the Q&A, and then at the end of the webinar, we will have an opportunity to go through and answer any questions that come through. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself. So my name is Amy Jewitt, and I am the Pennsylvania iMapInvasives Program Coordinator. I've been in this role for a little bit over 10 years now at this point. I'm based in the Pittsburgh region, and I do a lot of education and outreach events like our training today. But the kind of the meat of what I do with my job is a lot with the iMapInvasives program, educating people about how to use the platform, and doing a lot of QC of the data that comes through so that we can understand where some of these species are being found at across the state. So I'll let Brian introduce himself and then Mary afterwards.
Thanks, Amy. So my name is Brian Daggs, and I'm the invasive plant ecologist at WPC. Like Amy, I'm also based out of the Pittsburgh region. In this role that I've been in for roughly 2 years, I mostly do invasive species surveying focused in the northwest part of the state around the Erie watershed and French Creek watershed. But I also assist Amy with the iMapInvasives program, whether that's, working on outreach events like this, or just general help with the database, identifying records that come through, et cetera. And I will then let Mary go ahead and introduce herself.
All righty. Hi, I'm Mary Walsh. I'm with the Natural Heritage Program at WPC, like the rest of us. I've been hired as an aquatic ecologist when I first started this job a while back, and more recently I've been working on the iMapInvasives program and managing some of our invasive surveys and treatments.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mary. And we will hopefully have a little bit more time at the end of the presentation to talk about iMapInvasives, but we really want to focus on going over the species that we'll be talking about with you all today. So I just wanted to give a brief overview of where we're coming from with why we're talking about these early detection invasive species, and a little bit more about some of the work that we have done. So starting in 2021, Brian and myself, along with Mary, have been doing some work to create some digital fact sheets about species that we consider early detection, or in other words, species that are either not in Pennsylvania yet, but are in nearby areas, or ones that we do have here in the state, but maybe are not very common. And so these are ones that I think a lot of people don't really have on your radar because they're not common. We don't see them often like we do many other species. And yet we know that it's so important to know about these species and be looking for them, because if we do find them, we want to make sure that we are reporting them and hopefully acting quickly to get others like natural resource professionals and land managers aware, so that we can hopefully do some management and stop their spread and make sure they're not going into other locations, because we really want to prevent the next big problem, something like spotted lanternfly, for example. And so we created these fact sheets as a way to help to educate other people about these species. And we do have links to all these species and the fact sheets on the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy's website. There's a page called the Invader Watch List. There's a link actually to that webpage in the chat. I will also put it in the Q&A because I'm not sure if folks have access to the chat. So I will make sure that I do that. There is a QR code here on this page you can scan. It will take you directly to that page. And there is also a URL here at the bottom of this page. You can access it that way too. So I just want to give a little bit of a teaser and show you very quickly the species that we'll be talking about today. And then I'll jump in with the first few, and then Brian will take his turn, and then Mary afterwards. So the first species we'll be talking about is Asian longhorn beetle. We'll get to that in a moment. Also talking about a species called water soldier, Java water dropwort, Nutria, leatherleaf Mahonia, Japanese chaff flower, flattened rush, giant reed, African clawed frog, and then we'll wrap up by talking about blue catfish. So let's begin. So I'm going to start off by talking about Asian longhorn beetle. So I want to first mention this is not a species that we have in Pennsylvania yet, as far as we know. So if you haven't seen it before, that's why, because we don't think that we have it here in the States so far, and let's hope we keep it that way. But Asian longhorn beetle, also known as ALB, it's kind of a nice abbreviation, a little bit easier to say. ALBs will feed on 12 genera of hardwood tree species. And over time, as they continue to feed on those trees and the nutrients in them, they will kill those trees over time. And so to try to get a better understanding of the level of damage that this species can cause, the USDA APHIS website has information on there saying that this species has the potential to cause more damage than Dutch elm disease, chestnut blight, and spongy moths combined. And if you're familiar with any of those other invasive problems, you know that by themselves, they're really, they're pretty big, and they have a lot of issues associated with them as far as economics and environmental problems. And so combining all three of them, I think, is saying something to say that this species can even do more damage than that overall. And so this is one that can really make a big impact on our hardwood tree species that we have across the country. So as far as identifying this particular pest, adult Asian longhorn beetles can grow to be up to 1.5 inches long. Their bodies are shiny and black, and they have these irregular white spots that you can see over top of their wing coverings. Another name for the Asian longhorn beetle is actually called the starry sky beetle. So you can see where it gets that name from. Their legs and antennae are banded black and white. And if you look closely, you can see there's a bit of a bluish tinge to their antennae and also their legs. The antennae on the male beetles are about 1 to 2 times as long as their body, and the antennae on the females are about the same length as their body. So you can search for Asian longhorn beetle wherever you're finding hardwood tree species. There's 12 genera that we know it will go after. So things like oak trees, we don't know that they go after those, so probably don't look at those necessarily. But we do see some of these other species that it will infest. I've highlighted maple here because we've seen a preference for maple trees by Asian longhorn beetle. Some people have referred to the maples as the ALB's chocolate. And so you can pay special attention to the maple trees because they really seem to like them especially. So if you're searching for this species, in addition to looking for the beetle itself, which emerges in the spring and summertime, you can also be looking year-round for other things as well. And that's what we consider the evidence of maybe an infestation in an area. So things like egg sites, which you can see in the image there on the left, and also the upper right image as well. Those are areas where a female Asian longhorn beetle will chew a depression into the tree, and she will lay a single egg into that egg site. Over time, that egg will develop into a larva, and then a pupa, and then eventually an adult beetle. And that adult beetle will then emerge from that tree in what's called an exit hole. And the exit hole is always perfectly round. It looks kind of like a bullet hole in the tree. And so if you see any of those things, that could be an indication of an Asian longhorn beetle infestation in that area. Frass is another thing that you can be looking for. I didn't include a photo of that here, but frass is just a fancy word for beetle excrement or beetle poop. And so it resembles sawdust. So if you see something that looks like sawdust in around the bases of tree branches or at the bottom of a tree, you may again, be looking at a potential infestation by Asian longhorn beetle. So there are a variety of other beetles and other types of insects that can resemble ALB. One of them is the white-spotted pine sawyer. So you can see, just kind of looking at it from a glance, that it does look very similar. But if you look closely, you can see that the coloring of the sawyer is more of a bronzy black color. And also there is a distinct white spot right in between where the head and the base of the wing covers are. That beetle always has that white spot there. The Asian longhorn beetle does not. So those are some things that you can be looking for as far as telling them apart. There's other types of insects here, another type of sawyer. This is the southern white-spotted sawyer. Can look very similar, but the coloring is different. You can see the southern white-spotted sawyer has more of a mottled, lighter brown color to it. And then finally, there's another type of sawyer, the northeast sawyer, that again can look very similar, but the coloring is a little bit different. So there are other insects that can resemble Asian longhorn beetle. Here's a glance at just some of them. So again, just keeping in mind, these are insects that are not a problem. So just make sure that you're keeping in mind that we're looking for that one particular species there, that ALB, not to be confused with some of these other things. So as I mentioned, ALB is not in Pennsylvania. That's a really good thing. We do not want this species here. But it is in several states that are very close by, including New York, Massachusetts, Ohio, and then there's also a more recent infestation in South Carolina. So again, be vigilant for this species. Just because it's not here now doesn't mean it couldn't get here. So if we can find something like this early, if it does come to our state, we do want to make sure that we can do that and find that and make sure that we're reporting it. And speaking of reporting, if you do find this species, the USDA APHIS, the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, has a website. And if you find the Asian longhorn beetle, they do have an area where you can submit reports for it. So here on their website, you can see where you could click on report it, and then you'll come up then with a form that you can fill in. That information will go directly to the USDA because this is a federally regulated species. And so any reports need to go directly to them. So if you'd like to learn more about Asian longhorn beetle in the fact sheet that we've created, you can scan this QR code right here, or you can go to that invader watch list that's on the WPC website. Okay, so the next species I'll be talking about is called water soldier. So this is an aquatic plant that can form dense mats of floating and submerged vegetation. And ultimately, over time, it can crowd out our native species, which results in decreased biodiversity in areas that certainly we do not want that to happen. In addition to having these environmental impacts to our native species, it can also be a problem for people who enjoy doing outdoor recreational activities like boating and angling and swimming. It's really hard to do those activities in places where water soldier is infesting. It also has the potential to alter surrounding water chemistry, and that can harm phytoplankton and other aquatic organisms that may be in those areas. So as far as identifying this species, it can appear in two different forms, both emergent and submergent, so both above and below the water. The leaves are very rigid. They are sword-shaped, and they're very bright green. And if you look at this species closely, you can see that the edges are toothed or saw edge, and they are very sharp. So you do want to make sure if you're in an area where this species is, that you're being very careful about how you might be handling it. It does produce some white flowers that has 3 petals, but the nearest population to us is in Ontario for this species. And they have not really noticed that population of water soldier has produced a lot of flowers. So that may or may not be a distinguishing characteristic that you can look for. So as far as where you might be looking for water soldier, it prefers to be in more freshwater type settings, and that can include wet ditches, ponds, lakes, and also rivers. It really seems to prefer the more slower moving or stagnant water bodies. So it's generally not found in fast flowing water, or in areas where the water levels might be fluctuating. It can resemble some of our native aquatic plants, so keep in mind some of those things. And here's a few examples. So a native plant, branched burr reed, can look similar. But one of the things that can be a distinguishing characteristic to look for are those spiky fruiting bodies that branch burr reed will make. Water soldier does not do that. You can also see the leaves are a bit different. They're not quite as large, and they don't have the toothed edges like water soldier does. Another potential lookalike species, this is arrowhead. Again, it's coming up out of the water. So you might confuse it because of that. But if you look very closely at the foliage of arrowhead, you can see where it gets its name. It does have that kind of more arrow shape to it. So it is very different from water soldier in that regard. And then finally, the submergent part of water soldier can sometimes resemble another of our native species, which is eelgrass. But there are some differences between the two. The water soldier forms more of a rosette, and the eelgrass is a bit different in that regard. So as far as the distribution of this species, as I mentioned, Ontario is the Canadian province that is known to have this species. There are no confirmed sightings so far that we know of for water soldier in the States. However, the threat to our waterways remains because the climate conditions in our region here in the Mid-Atlantic area do match the conditions of where water soldier can grow. So again, this is a species that we do want to be looking for and be vigilant about. So here's again a QR code. You can scan that. It will take you directly to this fact sheet, or you can visit the WPC website to access it as well. The next species I'll talk about is called Java water dropwort. This is a species that can form dense colonies. It's a very aggressive ground cover that can spread into wetland areas and ultimately outcompete our native species. It can also choke out streams and other waterways where it can establish over time. And this can cause a decline in that area's ecological integrity and also decreases recreational value in those places as well. So as far as identifying this species, you can look for a plant that will grow anywhere from 9 to 28 inches tall. The leaves are pinnately compound and they are arranged alternately on the stem. And the leaves will resemble those of celery. So if you're seeing a plant that looks like celery, you might actually be looking at Java water dropwort, but it lacks that thick petiole that celery would have, which is the part that we typically eat for celery. And then in late summer and early autumn, it does produce these showy white flowers that will form in an umbel shape at the end of the stalks. So you can look for Java water dropwort in both wild and cultivated settings, but it does require areas that are wet. So look in those areas with wet soils, and often it can be found in standing water. So again, specific places to look for this plant might include freshwater marshes, swampy fields, lake shores, wet meadows, canals, and also streams. And again, just like water soldier, it's going to prefer those more slower moving or stagnant water type areas. There are some other species that it can resemble. And so here's one example, just looking at the flowers and the leaves, it might seem similar to wild parsnip, but the flower color is going to be what makes it easy to differentiate. So the Java water dropwort will have the white flowers and the wild parsnip has the yellow flowers. It may also resemble another species, bishop's weed. Again, the flowers can look very similar, but if you look at the leaves and the leaf structure of the two species, you can see that there is a pretty big difference there. So that should help you to distinguish it between that species. It can also resemble plants in the genus Osmorrhiza. And so here's an example of a plant in that genus. This is hairy sweet cicely. So again, similar looking, but if you look more closely at the flowers and the leaf structure, you can see that they do have some differences between the two. And then finally, it can also resemble plants in the genus Angelica. So here's an example. This is purple stemmed Angelica. So you can see the flower head can have some similarities, but it is fairly different, and the stem coloring is also different here for that species. So Java water dropwort has been found in several US states. And so you can see that here. Again, this is one that is in Pennsylvania. And then according to the US Geological Survey, at least one population was discovered in the state of New Hampshire, but has since been eradicated. And so as far as Pennsylvania is concerned, so far we do have confirmed sightings of this plant in both Berks and Franklin counties, but nowhere else as far as we know yet that's been confirmed. So again, you can access this fact sheet by scanning our QR code or visiting the WPC website. And then the last species that I'll be talking about is Nutria. This is a species also known by the name coypus. So you may have heard one or the other before. It will consume wetland vegetation. It also eats mussels and crustaceans. And so over time, uncontrolled populations of Nutria can really impact wetland communities. Really changes how things look and how they operate. And so ultimately in these areas where it's impacting, that loss of plant biomass can really further stress these areas that may already be under stress from other things like invasive species. So as far as identifying Nutria, you're looking for an animal that has kind of an arched body. It almost appears humpbacked, and it's covered in dense brown fur. If you look closely, you can sort of see it in this image. The teeth are bright orange. The males weigh up to 20 pounds, females weigh up to 18 pounds, and their eyes, ears, and their nose are positioned high up on their head. And this is an adaptation that they have to live in the semi-aquatic areas that they prefer to be in. So they have a strong preference for being in freshwater marshes that are abundant in emergent plants. And so they really want to have those food sources at the ready for themselves. You can also find them in places like lakes, swamps, rivers, bayous, impoundments, and even saltwater and brackish areas, again, as long as that vegetation is abundant in those areas. There are two species that you might confuse Nutria with, and that's American beaver and muskrat. But if you're looking at the two side by side, you can notice some differences. So beavers are going to be much larger than Nutria. They can grow to be up to 40 pounds. And they also have a very broad flattened tail. And so that's probably one of the good distinguishing characteristics that you can look for. The beavers also have fully webbed feet. And then as far as muskrats, compared to Nutrias, the muskrats are going to be much smaller than the Nutria. They're going to weigh only about 2 to 5 pounds, and they have a laterally flattened tail, and they have no webbing on their feet. Another distinguishing characteristic that you can look for, the Nutria is going to have these white whiskers around their nose. Beavers and muskrats are not going to have that. So as far as distribution, we know over time there has been Nutria in 30 states. However, currently there's only established populations in about 16 states, as well as parts of Canada. There's no known occurrences of Nutria in Pennsylvania, as far as we know, but other successful populations in more northern states suggest that we could have Nutria established here. So again, if you'd like to check out this fact sheet on Nutria and learn a little bit more about that species, you can do so by scanning that QR code or visiting our website. So we have some polls for you guys. I forgot to mention this at the beginning. So we have some polls to test your knowledge of what we just talked about. There's going to be 2 more polls after this one. So I'm going to go ahead and launch the first poll for everybody. And you can go ahead and we'll take about 30 seconds. Folks can go ahead and start taking that the quiz essentially that we have here, and we'll see how everyone does. So go ahead and look at those questions and do your best to provide an answer. And once everyone is wrapped up, I will go through the answers quickly so that everyone knows how you did. Okay, I'm seeing some answers coming in. So again, we'll take about another 10 to 15 seconds here and then we'll wrap things up. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. And I will share those results with everyone. So hopefully you can see them. So looking at that first question, Asian longhorn beetle is an invasive insect that currently inhabits Pennsylvania, along with other nearby states, including New York, Ohio, Massachusetts, and South Carolina. The answer to that was false because the statement says it currently inhabits Pennsylvania, and that is not true. This is not a species we have in Pennsylvania currently, but it does inhabit the other states that are listed there. So it's sort of a trick question. Second question, water soldier prefers to inhabit slow-moving or stagnant water bodies. That is true. Third question, the leaves of Java water dropwort closely resemble those of celery, but without the thick petiole. And finally, beavers are a lookalike species of Nutria, but can be differentiated from Nutria because they are larger in size and have a broad flattened tail. So good job, everybody. Thanks for taking that first poll. And now I'm going to hand things over to Brian.
Thanks, Amy. So moving on, our next early detection invader is the Leatherleaf Mahonia. This species is also known as Beal's barberry. That's because it is in the same family as a more famous invasive species, the Japanese barberry. Some taxonomists will actually place this species in that same genus, calling it Berberis bealei. At iMapInvasives, we call it Mahonia bealei, a very closely related genus. This species is a problem because it reproduces both vegetatively as clones and through abundant seedlings to quickly form dense colonies. This species is very shade tolerant, invading forest understories, unlike much of the other invasive shrubs that we see that are usually light-loving species. In those understories, as it quickly grows and spreads, it will outcompete native vegetation. Its seeds and fruits, the fruits appear as these dark bluish purple berries that are very attractive to birds. And so birds will eat those fruits and spread seeds to distant areas to create new infestations and new forest stands far away from the original parent plant. This species is pretty distinctive. You really won't see too many things that look like it. So you would not have trouble really picking it out amongst an understory. Its leaves are very large, but are divided into leaflets. The leaflets are arranged as a pinnately compound leaf. So each leaflet are in opposite pairs going along the central vein of the leaf with a terminal leaflet at the very end. The leaflets are very sharply pointed and leathery, and the leaves grow in these tiers along a central stem. So the bottom right image shows these very large leaves divided into leaflets and how they kind of grow as tiers going up the stem, eventually reaching the apex of the plant where you get a cluster of yellow flowers. Next slide. So Leatherleaf Mahonia prefers to grow in shady forests with a closed canopy, which is a habitat that is often, resistant to a lot of other invasive plants. It prefers to grow in moist, acidic to neutral soils, and often avoids full sun exposure when growing naturally. However, in a more cultivated setting, with a lot of extra care, it will survive in more open spaces. Like I said, it's a pretty distinctive species and you won't see too much like it, but there are a few species that somewhat resemble it, that being Oregon grape, Mahonia aquifolium, which is a close cousin to Leatherleaf Mahonia, and another non-native species that we have in Pennsylvania, along with the American holly, Ilex opaca. Next slide. So Leatherleaf Mahonia looks a lot like its much smaller cousin, the Oregon grape. Oregon grape is native to the northwest part of the United States and also occurs as an escaped ornamental species here in the eastern US. Very quickly, you can see some differences. Oriental grape is a lot smaller, maybe usually not growing more than 1 meter tall, whereas Leatherleaf Mahonia will eventually reach heights of maybe 2 meters. The leaves and stems of Oregon grape have a bit more reddish color to them, whereas a leatherleaf Mahonia is pretty green throughout. Next slide. The easiest way to tell is looking at the undersides of the leaf, however. Leatherleaf Mahonia on the underside of the leaf does not have a very strong central mid-vein. Instead, it has 3 to 5 more distinct veins on the underside that you can see, whereas Oregon grape on the underside of the leaf has a very distinct raised central mid-vein that goes along the leaflet. Next slide. American holly also, somewhat superficially represents the leatherleaf Mahonia, but there are some obvious differences. American holly does not have divided leaves. Instead, it has, single, simple leaves that are alternately arranged on a stem. They do look a little similar because both leaves are leathery, they're bright green, and have sharp pointed ends. But the alternate arrangement versus opposite arrangements of the leaves on leatherleaf Mahonia is a key difference. American holly also flowers out of axils, out of the leaf axils along the stem, whereas leatherleaf Mahonia has a central or several central flowering spikes at the very top of the plant. Next slide. So because these are early detection species, we don't necessarily have the best distribution information. So through EdMaps, we can see several counties where leatherleaf Mahonia has established that are mostly concentrated in the Southeast United States. However, on the next slide, we will see more current reports through iNaturalist that show that this species is certainly spreading outside of that southeastern range. So this is showing research grade data from iNaturalist. So presences that have been reviewed by more than one people, and the community has a general consensus on their ID. On the next slide, we will zoom into Pennsylvania a little bit, where we can see that it's starting to appear. Now, pretty much all of these presences from Pennsylvania are from about the last 5 to maybe 10 years. Before then, we have no data and no occurrences on this species. All of the presences are mostly concentrated around urban or suburban areas where folks have started to plant this in their landscaping. And we're starting to see, the emergence of seedlings in nearby woodlands from those points. Next slide. And so we have the other plants, we have a fact sheet on this. You can scan the QR code on the page here to get more in-depth information, and we will also link these out to you all. Next slide. The next species that we're going to look at is the Japanese chaff flower, Achyranthes japonica. This is a species that is not recorded to be present in Pennsylvania just yet, but is one we are on the lookout for. This is a significant issue because it forms very dense stands in riparian habitats and bottomland forests that will outcompete and displace native vegetation. Some reports in areas where it's heavily infested already report that this species is also outcompeting other invasive plants, including Japanese knotweed. It is very prolific and can produce up to 16,000 seeds per square meter of an infestation. The seeds and fruits have these bracts that cling to wildlife or even cling to any kind of fabric material. Could be wildlife fur, could be clothing, could be feathers. And those bracts will hold on tight and facilitate long-range dispersal as the seeds hitchhike on anything moving through an infested stand. So Japanese chaff flower has these oppositely arranged leaves that are a simple oval shape with smooth, sometimes wavy margins and these deep arcing veins that arc toward the edges of the leaf. The fruits are arranged on spikes, and each spike and each fruit has a pair of bracts at the base that, like I said, will cling to anything that brushes against it. Japanese chaff flower often has some purple coloration in the stems, usually around the nodes where new leaves are arising. Next slide. Its preferred habitat is usually within riparian corridors that likes lowland forests and disturbance margins that trigger seed germination or areas where seeds are introduced. It prefers upper stream banks to avoid regular flooding. It lacks a tolerance for regular flooding and extremely wet conditions, but likes to be adjacent to those wet conditions in fairly moist soils. It usually prefers partial sun exposure, which is why riparian corridors are a great place for it, where you get sparser trees towards the edges of forests as it interfaces a stream or creek. There are a few things that look like it, but it's overall pretty distinctive. Some of the main lookalikes we'll look at are American lopseed, Phryma leptostachya, white vervain, Verbena urticifolia, and dogwoods, the genus Cornus. And next slide. So Japanese chaff flower probably mostly resembles American lopseed, and that is for the fruits. Both of these species have fruits arranged on a spike at the top of the plant that have these sticky bracts that will cling to anything that brushes upon it. However, there are some pretty key distinctions. Like I mentioned before, the fruits of Japanese chaff flower have bracts that are situated at the base of the fruit, whereas on American lopseed, the bracts are at the very tip of the fruit. In addition, American lopseed has a bit more of an irregular leaf shape. It's a little difficult to see, but they're more shaped like a spade oftentimes with these very coarsely toothed margins. Next slide. Japanese chaff flower may also resemble white vervain. White vervain is a native species that will grow in a similar habitat, usually associated with creek sides, stream banks, and the like. And it has a similar growth form where it has oppositely arranged leaves that are somewhat oval shaped and flowering spikes. One of the main differences is that white vervain will produce many more flowering spikes than Japanese chaff flower that have little white flowers versus the somewhat dull green flowers on Japanese chaff flower. And the leaves on white vervain are also toothed as compared to the smooth margins that you see on the leaves of Japanese chaff flower. Next slide. And then lastly, Japanese chaff flower will often resemble dogwood seedlings. Both of these have arcing veins on the leaves, and most dogwoods, not all, but most, have oppositely arranged leaves similar to Japanese chaff flower. Seedlings are going to be very difficult to tell apart sometimes, but what you can look for is a woody base or stem on the dogwood seedlings. Japanese chaff flower is completely herbaceous, whereas dogwoods eventually become woody shrubs. Next slide. So Japanese chaff flower is mostly concentrated along the Ohio and upper Mississippi rivers. However, this map does not show the full story as it's been spreading, long distances being carried by wildlife. Next slide. The most up-to-date reports on iNaturalist of research grade occurrences show Japanese chaff flower spreading into massive disjunct populations in areas like Texas, North Carolina, Virginia, New York, and even Ontario around Lake Erie. Next slide. And this spread is mostly being facilitated by migratory birds. For example, the population found in Ontario on an island in the middle of Lake Erie was most likely spread by migrating double-crested cormorants that go to that island to nest. Next slide. Additional information can be found at this fact sheet, scanning the QR code, or like before, we will link it directly as well. And the last species I'd like to talk about is flattened rush, Juncus compressus. So this species forms dense colonies in either low quality waste areas or high quality wetlands. This species threatens sensitive fen habitats, which are peatlands that are rich in native plant and insect biodiversity. This reproduces by both seeds and underground rhizomes, which can facilitate long range spread via contaminated soils. Juncus rushes overall are a little tricky to ID. They're pretty technical, but in general, this species has a round stem like all rushes. It'll grow up to 30 inches tall with flattened channeled leaves. So the leaves have these channeling or grooves in them, and it has these dark brown rounded fruit capsules that are very small, only 2.5 to maybe 3.5 millimeters wide. Next slide. It prefers moist, wet, and saturated soils, growing in moist waste areas such as ditches, around railroads and canals. It also occurs in natural wetlands, including mineral-rich fens and other seepage wetlands where groundwater seeps back up toward the surface. It can tolerate brackish water and soils impacted by road salts, and mostly grows in open, sunny areas. Its lookalikes will mostly be limited to other rush species, native rushes, as well as the salt marsh rush, Juncus dorretii. Next slide. So flattened rush has a few things that distinguish it from most other native rush species. Its flowers are solitary, each on their own little branch in the inflorescence. There are some native rushes that do this, but most native rushes do not have these very dark seed capsules and are usually not as rounded as flattened rush. That coupled with its smaller size and unpartitioned leaves, so leaves that do not split or part at any point. So the three of these characteristics together pretty strongly differentiated from native rush species. Next slide. The other strong lookalike is a rush species that is not native to Pennsylvania, but is native on the east coast of the United States, is salt marsh rush. Both these species have darker brown, very rounded seed capsules, but one of the ways you differentiate is that the bracts, these tiny little leaf-like structures on the fruits of flattened rush, do not extend past the fruit capsule itself, whereas on salt marsh rush, those flats are typically longer than the fruit capsules. Next slide. Given that this is a pretty technical and difficult to identify species, there aren't too many great data points for it. Most of what we know comes from herbarium specimens. So there is one occurrence of this species from Pennsylvania. It occurs in Southwest Pennsylvania, I believe in Beaver County, where a botanist collected a few specimens from a population growing on a roadside. Otherwise is fairly absent from Pennsylvania, but threatens some of our fen habitats, which are already at risk from a variety of other factors. Next slide. And that is just an image of the specimens that were collected from the single occurrence in Pennsylvania. Next. Showing overall the states where it's been found. It's mostly concentrated around the Great Lakes, but also appears quite a bit in the other Rocky Mountain areas. I would assume some high elevation wetlands that occur over there. Next. If you want to learn more about this species, there's the QR code right there, and then we will also get you the link.
Okay, so we'll launch into our second poll. So I'll go ahead and get that started for everybody. Okay, so test your knowledge of what you just learned from Brian. And we'll take about 20-30 seconds here, give some folks some time to look over everything. Okay, results are coming in. We'll give folks about another 10 seconds or so here. Want to make sure we give Mary enough time for her part coming up here soon. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. Thanks to everybody for taking that. So I will go ahead and share those results. So the first question, the leaflet tips of Leatherleaf Mahonia are sharp and pointed. Japanese chaff flower produces up to 16,000 seeds per square meter of infestation. And flattened rush has a round stem, like all rushes. So thanks to everybody for taking that quiz, and we will stop sharing those. And we will go ahead and get started with Mary's section. So thanks, Brian. Mary, you're still on mute.
All right. There, I'm back. Okay, we're going to end the webinar with one more plant and two more animals, and then if we have time, we'll wrap up with some info about iMapInvasives. Okay, so the first one we're going to be talking about is giant reed, Arundo donax. So it's an ornamental perennial warm season grass, which grows quite tall, giving it a similar appearance to Phragmites or common reed. It's one of the fastest growing terrestrial plants in the world. And one estimate I saw for controlling it was $25,000 an acre. So it's a very high risk invader because of its ability to alter habitats and ecological processes, particularly the riparian environment, because it's an aggressive. Oh, hold on. Sorry, press something. Okay, there we go. Let's see. Yeah, because it's such a fast-growing plant, it's been used for building materials, erosion control, biofuel. It's also a source of reeds for wind instruments. Next slide, please. Okay. Yep, it looks a lot, it's quite tall. Like I mentioned, looking a lot like Phragmites, and it can grow, to its full height in one season, usually up to 16 feet, but can get bigger. And it has those long and wide leaves that are really rounded at the base. So they can have a variegated appearance, that green and white striping, and it has a pretty thick stem, up to 2 inches wide, but it's hollow. The inflorescence is an elongated spike at the top of the plant there that has a feathery brown appearance, and it can be as long as 3 feet. Next slide, please. All right, so it could be compared to other ornamental grasses like pampas grasses. The inflorescence has a similar appearance to giant reed, but the pampas grasses usually have more of a silvery white coloration to their inflorescence. And they're not nearly as tall. I mean, they do get tall up to 10 feet, but not quite as ginormous as the giant reed. And the pampas grasses are clumping grasses, where they're spread by seeds rather than the rhizomes like giant reed. And their leaves are much thinner, and they're, single stalks growing from the tussock rather than branching from a central stem. Next slide, please. All right. Yep. And so common reed is quite widespread in Pennsylvania. So it's in Northwest and Southeast PA. So you might see it and think that it could be giant reed, but it's worth a closer look. It also grows really fast, but the stem is not quite as thick as giant reed. It's only around ½ an inch or less. The leaves on common reed are thinner, 1.5 inches or less, so they're not quite as gigantic as giant reed. And let's see, and they're not the common reed also has hairy ligules, so where you pull back the leaf from the stem and look at the upper side of it, that fringy area that you see in that center picture looks a bit different on giant reed compared to a more sort of membranous ligule on giant reed compared to the hairy one on common reed. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so in the eastern US, giant reed is naturalized to the southern states, including Maryland, and it's starting to show up as occurrences where it's escaping from cultivation in western Pennsylvania. But as far as I know, I don't think we have any established populations. You see in the map on the right side, though, the USDA's map of potential occurrences in North America. And so giant reed certainly could inhabit Pennsylvania based on this prediction. Next slide, please. All right, and there's our fact sheet QR code. If you want to take a second to scan that. Okay, next slide, please. All right, we're going to be talking about this funny looking frog, the African cloud frog. It's from sub-Saharan Africa, and it's sold in the pet trade, and it's also been used for laboratory studies. So it's been in the US for a while. It can invade standing waters of body like wetlands, ponds, lakes. I don't think it's too particular though. So any sort of, standing body of water it could tolerate. And although it's from Africa, it can tolerate some colder conditions too. It does have a high reproductive rate. And so the populations could grow quickly in the right environment. It is a carrier of the chytrid fungus, which is known for wiping out amphibian populations. So, and that's, we wouldn't want it to spread that anymore to our native populations of amphibians. Next slide, please. All right, so it has a very flattened body. So it does look quite different from any of our native frogs. And those kind of small, sort of cartoonish eyes really make it distinct. It does have that kind of mottled olive blotchy skin and a white underside to it. The front feet are small and they don't have any webbing, but the back feet are distinct, and you can see that center picture, those 3 black claws on the back feet. The tadpoles are distinct as well. They're transparent, and they have that long barbel that gives it that catfish appearance. There is another species of Xenopus. You can see it in that picture on the left. It's that smaller frog. So the African cloud frogs are much larger. Next slide, please. Okay, so it does have some, I think, well-established populations in California and Arizona, Washington, and Florida, and it is showing up in a few other places. So as far as I know, we don't have any established populations in Pennsylvania. What I could find about its cold tolerance in the literature is that it needs above freezing temperatures. So it's unlikely that we would, have, especially in the colder parts of the state, populations establishing. But in areas where we have, warmer winters like Southeast Pennsylvania, it could certainly show up there if people are dumping their pets. Next slide, please. Okay, and that is our QR code for the African cloud frog. All right, next slide. All right, I'm going to talk about blue catfish as my last species before I wrap up here. And it's one of those species that's native to Pennsylvania, but also non-native to some drainages. So it's from the Ohio Basin in Western Pennsylvania. So if you look at that USGS map, The native basins are that orangey yellow color. So you can see in Western Pennsylvania, it's native to that part of the state. And there, it has been extirpated from the Ohio River and the three rivers in that part. But it's part of a restoration program that has begun. So we are now stocking it, the three rivers in Pennsylvania. So it's a sport fish, and I think a lot of people. Oh, all right. So it's a sport fish, and I think a lot of people are excited about that restoration. But we are concerned about it because it's showing up in the lower.
There's still just
Okay, Brian's telling me he's having trouble hearing me. I'll try to speak up. Hopefully that'll work. So we're concerned about its occurrences in the Potomac Basin and in the Susquehanna below the Conowingo Dam in Maryland. All right, next slide, please. Okay, and yeah, this just shows the story from the goerie.com. So if you were interested in finding out a little bit more about the restoration of blue catfish in the Ohio River, you can look up that story, but some interesting fun facts about it. Next slide, please. All right, so if you are a fisherman and out pulling catfish from the rivers, say in the Susquehanna, you would want to be keeping an eye out for an occurrence of blue catfish. And they could be confused with something like flathead catfish, but the coloration is different. The blue catfish do have that blue-gray color with no spots, as opposed to yellow-brown color in the flatheads. They both get pretty large, and so there's overlap in size. But one distinguishing characteristic is the anal fin. So if you're looking on the left photo there, on the blue catfish, it has a straight edge to the anal fin, and it has up to 36 rays. So that's a different count of rays for the flathead catfish, which only has up to 17. They both do have forked tails. It's much more deeply forked in the blue catfish. And the flathead catfish has a white upper lobe on their tail, especially in the juveniles and young adults. You can see the coloration's a little bit lighter in that one photo. Their profile from the side does look different as well. The blue catfish have that protruding upper jaw as opposed to a protruding lower jaw in the flathead catfish. Next slide, please. Okay, so another catfish to compare to is the channel cat, which tends to be a brown yellow and also has spots on it compared to the blue catfish with no spots. They do have overlap in size as well, but the anal fin rays do have different counts between them. And then you can compare that straight edge of the blue catfish's anal fin to a more rounded margin on the channel catfish. And they do both have forked tails, so that's one similarity. Next slide, please. So yeah, as I mentioned, the blue catfish is popping up in some of our eastern watersheds. And so if you look at the map on the right side there, all the states in the eastern US that have watersheds that drain to the Atlantic Ocean, all those occurrences are non-native. But we are, they're keeping an eye on the species where it might show up in the Pennsylvania Atlantic slope watersheds because of our concern about its invasiveness there. Okay, next slide. And then there is our QR code for blue catfish. So you can look up the individual fact sheet there. Okay, and I'll turn it over to Amy for the third poll.
Okay, yep, I'll go ahead and launch that. Okay, so go ahead, take a look at those questions for information that was just covered by Mary. And we'll give folks about another 10 to 15 seconds here so we can quickly wrap up with our presentation today. Okay, we'll go ahead and end our poll. So thanks to everybody for testing out your knowledge. We'll go over those answers real quick. First question, giant reed prefers to inhabit riparian habitats, wetlands, and ditches. Established populations of African clawed frog currently exist in Washington State, California, Arizona, and Florida. That is true. And finally, in Pennsylvania, blue catfish are historically native to the Ohio River and lower Allegheny and Monongahela rivers. That is also true. So thanks to everybody for taking our last poll. And I see we're pretty much right at 11 o'clock. So I'm just going to quickly go through our last remaining slides and just touch on them very briefly so we can get to our Q&A. So I'll just mention iMapInvasives for anyone that may not already be familiar with what IMAP is. It is a free online tool that you can use to record where you're finding invasive species as well as logging management efforts. So if you'd like to use that to report any findings of invasives you are finding, whether that's common or any of the early detection species that we talked about today, please do so. With the one exception of the Asian longhorn beetle, we do encourage you to use that USDA APHIS website if you're finding that species. Here is our website, iMapInvasives.org. You can register or log in by clicking on the buttons there at the top. And here is where you can either sign in with an existing username and password or signing up using the form that is provided there. I'll just mention very quickly, photography matters when you're contributing data to iMapInvasives for presence information. You want to make sure that your pictures are really good because that's what we're utilizing to confirm your data. We do partner with a variety of experts across the state, and good photos are really critical in order to confirm that information. So remember to take up close images that capture a species distinguishing characteristics. And when possible, include something to show scale or size of a species like a ruler or your hand. Avoid taking pictures that look like this, that are taken from a distance, or are your camera is not focused on the target species that you're observing. So we do have some YouTube videos that are available that show how to use our mobile apps so you can collect data while you're out in the field. And here at the bottom of this page, we do have a YouTube channel that has a variety of other tutorials, as well as recorded information sessions that you can check out at your leisure. So with that, I will leave this slide up here so folks can jot down our contact information if you'd like to reach out with questions. But I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Brian, and he's going to moderate our question and answers.
Yep. So we've had a couple questions that rolled through during the presentation. First being, throwing back to the Asian longhorn beetle, do you have, or do we have a handout of the look-alike beetle species?
So there is a handout that shows some look-alike insects and other beetles that's from the Massachusetts Department of, forget what the word is, the title is, it's MDAR. But yes, we can get that information to you if you'd like. So just reach out to us and we can send that to you directly.
Okay. Another question, how similar is the Java water dropwort to water hemlock? Which I suppose I could answer. They're pretty similar. They're in the same family, which is the carrot family. They'll have similar flowers and flowering structures in general. However, water hemlock, which here in the eastern US, we're probably referring to Cicuta maculata, eastern water hemlock. There's also Cicuta douglasii, which is the western water hemlock. That's a West Coast species. But in general, I think water hemlock is a bit less of a robust species. So it'll just have a smaller size to it, you know, thinner stems, and less overall leaf cover. I'm just going off memory, but the leaves on water hemlock are a bit more variable and are often, you know, maybe just have a few leaflets on them, and in some cases will appear a bit more full, but not usually. So just in general, a smaller, less robust species compared to Java water dropwort. Okay. Does the longhorned beetle larva burrow into the tree? Wondering why the exit hole versus the depression where egg was laid.
Yeah, I can answer that. I forgot to mention in my presentation, so I actually worked for the Asian longhorn beetle eradication program in Worcester, Massachusetts for 3 years. So a lot of experience with this particular insect. Yeah, so it does burrow into the tree. So when the female ALB will chew that depression or that egg site into the side of the tree, and lays that egg, it will burrow into the tree, develop into a larva and then a pupa. And then while still inside the tree, it will develop into an adult beetle. And then it will emerge from the tree and it will chew that round exit hole and come out of the tree. So it does, you know, form and become that adult beetle inside the tree.
Okay.
And I'll
Thank you,
just
Amy.
mention, Brian or Mary, if you're able to put the link to the invader watch list in here, that would be helpful, or maybe I can do that also.
Yeah, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go ahead and do that.
Another question that came through, surprised that you mentioned Phragmites in relation to giant reed, but did not mention that it is invasive in coastal areas. Is it not considered a PA invasive because it is in saltwater ecosystems only? I can answer that in that Phragmites is a pretty big invasive in Pennsylvania. It establishes in both freshwater and coastal areas. We just, I don't know, I guess we didn't mention it specifically because the focus was on giant reed, which is more of an early detection for Pennsylvania, and Phragmites has been an established species for a very long time. A few more questions rolling in. A local nursery in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, sells a plant that they claim is a non-invasive hybrid of the leatherleaf Mahonia. Can this be true? Potentially, I don't know. I would have to research further. I've never read anything about any Mahonia hybrids, but I know that in the past, you know, for many decades, we've been sold hybrids and sterile cultivars that turn out to not be the case. So I can't say for certain, but I would definitely be skeptical. It's possible that it is a true non-invasive hybrid. I don't know for certain. I would have to look into it more. How deep does the longhorn burrow into the tree, and does it seem to have a preference for certain hardwood species?
Yeah, so I can answer that. So it kind of depends on the size of the tree, because the Asian longhorn beetle, like they'll lay egg sites in really small diameter trees, and then also, you know, pretty large ones as well. So it kind of depends on the space that they have available. I would say just you do some Googling and look at some images of what the inside of a tree can look like as far as the tunneling that it will create. So I guess the best answer is it depends on the size of the tree as far as how big the tunneling will be. And then as far as a preference for certain hardwood species, we have noticed it does seem to prefer the maples for whatever reason. There's probably some science behind that, and I don't have that at the tip of my fingers. But again, there is a list of 12 genera of hardwood species that it is known to infest. And I'll mention just really quick, for whatever reason, I'm not able to actually contribute to the Q&A, so I can't put that link into the invader watch list, but the recording that we will be sharing out with folks has that information. And so you can access that at a later time.
There was a little bit of follow-up to the Leatherleaf Mahonia question that was asked a few moments ago, in that the nursery claims what they sell is a sterile cultivar. Even when that is the case, it could possibly still reproduce vegetatively and take over a localized area by producing clones that emerge from the roots. So that is something that's important to consider.
And then it also looks like John Swartzer put in the chat the link to the lookalikes for the Asian longhorn beetle, in case folks would like to check that out. So thanks, John, for doing that. Appreciate it.
There's another question. How close is Leatherleaf Mahonia to Oregon grape, and do we have that in PA? How close do you mean in terms of geographically where they're located, or their relatedness, identification? Okay, so Leatherleaf Mahonia and Oregon grape are very closely related species. They're part of the same genus, and they're similar looking, but Leatherleaf Mahonia has more rigid, leathery, larger leaves compared to Oregon grape, and is overall a much larger species. Seeing if you were to see them in person, they would look pretty markedly different. We do have Oregon grape in PA, and it would potentially an invasive species. It's certainly not native, and is starting to escape, mostly around Northwest PA, where I've seen a lot of reports for it escaping into woodland areas. I know it's known to be a pretty significant invasive species in Europe, where it was introduced through horticultural trade, and it's potentially the same thing is happening here in Pennsylvania as well. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, well, it looks like John put one more comment in here. But I'm just going to go ahead and wrap things up, because I know we did go a bit over time, so apologies for that. But thanks to those who did stay on for the whole thing. Again, as I mentioned at the beginning, this webinar was recorded, so I will be sending out a link shortly, hopefully either today or tomorrow. And for anyone who wasn't able to join us today, you can check out that recording at your leisure. So thanks so much for your attention, and Brian and Mary and I had a good time, and we're happy to do this presentation to try to help raise more awareness of some of these species that folks may not know a lot about yet. So thanks again. Have a great rest of your day, everybody.